Huh? Oh, yeah. He was there. And, Jim Burke. Yeah, well, the other guy was really pissed because he had an entire um, tab, no, not just one page of a tablet with notes, and yeah, I think it's time, don't you? I mean, yeah. I mean, even in Athens, this in Athens would be 2 years before Portugal. Were you in Athens when we had to take the subway and then catch the bus? Okay, so Jim and I were on the bus. We came back, and we were staying at. We get off at a different stop to go to our hotel than he would, but I wasn't sure that he could find his way back to his hotel. So we rode back, and walked back to his hotel with him, saying we were going to a coffee shop near there. But
Nice.
all right.
Welcome everyone. Welcome this afternoon. My name is Gielt Algra. For those who do not know me, but I assume that everybody over here knows me anyhow. It's my honor to be the one to introduce Wilbur Scott this afternoon and to explain what we're going to do. First of all, Wilbur and I, we have a long history. We go back, I think, 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
It was 2001 or something. We met the first time over in Baltimore. There was a session on veterans, and there were a couple of young Vietnam veterans, 20 years young, drinking, and I was, of course, in the middle of them. And we got to this discussion over a few drinks, and he said, well, I'm going to go to Germany, perhaps to the Netherlands. And I said, well, if you come to the Netherlands, please come to the Veterans Institute and give a lecture. You always say these things in these receptions. The difference is Wilbur did it. I got an email just a couple of months later. I'm there, I'm going over. And I said, okay, we'll organize it. I had actually no idea by then. I was just a freshman at the Veterans Institute. Who was Wilbur Scott exactly? I had some senior managers, of course, in the Veterans Institute. And I told them, oh yeah, by the way, Wilbur Scott wants to come by and give a presentation. Some of them almost fell on the floor. What, Wilbur Scott? You know him? Yeah, well, I talked to him in the bar and whatever, and he's now coming over. Then I realized finally, okay, Wilbur might be a special one in military sociology. And I can say, I think I can say he is, because afterwards I had to read all his books and publications and whatever. And I can tell you he's really good, but you will see that this afternoon anyhow. Wilbur is a retired professor at the Air Force Academy and
University of Oklahoma.
University of Oklahoma, but also a Vietnam veteran. He served as a platoon officer in the 4th Infantry Division in the Highlands in 1967 in Vietnam. And for those of you who know something about the Vietnam War, the Highlands, 1967, that was really a hot spot. So he knows what he's talking about. I don't know what I have to add to this, all of this, but Wilbur and we stayed friends for a long time. And whenever we have in Argos a meeting with the veterans group, which I'm leading, Wilbur's always joining me. And I'm always happy that he's there because we're the senior person among us. We can always finalize everything which has been said, and then we have a conclusion. Wilbur has the habit to do this, and is very good in it. And I hope at the end of the afternoon he's capable of doing this again. Wilbur, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hiel. Well, it's an honor to be here again. Actually, it's good fortune to be here again, under the circumstances in particular. And I'm really impressed with the facilities that you now have. When I was here 20 years ago, it was much humbler surroundings and much limited food options too. I remember, my wife can tell you, we had one cheese sandwich and one glass of lemonade, and that was it for a lecture. So we've enjoyed much better accommodations this time. Thank you. All right, so I know I turned in a title for my talk to Hiel some time ago, but I'm going to talk a little bit about trends among U.S. veterans and something about the politics of commemoration, which actually wasn't a title I submitted earlier. So let's see. Oh, I see what's happening. There we go. Because I previously worked for the Department of Defense at the United States Air Force Academy, I'm required to, well, not required for that part of the slide, but I'm required to do this part of the slide. That is, nothing that I say represents the official policy of the United States. These are all my opinions. Okay. All right, so let's do a map of the United States. I'm always amazed at how much Dutch people know about the United States, and it's always embarrassing for us because Americans know so little about the Netherlands. But I put up the map because I'm going to use several, and then also I'm going to be referring to different places in the U.S. I'll be talking a little bit about the Civil War, and the Civil War took place in the United States, 1860 to 1865, and you can divide the country right along this line right here. And below, the period below, the area below, slavery was legal, and in the area above, it was not legal. So that area right there. And so when we refer to the southern part of the United States, referring to the area where slavery was legal, and the South is still different. The South and South, non-South differences figure politically in many different ways, including on veterans issues. I'll be talking about Louisiana. I went to school after I came back from Vietnam. I went to school here in Baton Rouge, down in South Louisiana. And I want to talk somewhat about Colorado. Colorado is located here in a very mountainous region within the country, and Colorado is important for us, veteran-wise, because in Colorado Springs, where we live, there are 5 military installations, so there are a lot of veterans there. All right, so a little bit about my training. So when I came back from Vietnam, I don't know where the idea came from, but I decided that I wanted to live in New Orleans. I just thought it would be cool to live in New Orleans. And so I looked at, I'm sorry, by the way, feel free to interject and ask questions anytime rather than saving your questions towards the end. You like New Orleans?
I've been there once with the Navy. I'm with the Navy.
Uh-huh.
And I've been there during Mardi Gras. So
Oh,
that's my view of New Orleans.
well, that's prime
I
time.
can understand why you would
Yeah,
go to New Orleans.
that's prime time to be there.
Yeah.
So, but means that I had two choices in terms of doctoral programs. One would be Tulane University in New Orleans, and the other 70 miles away was Louisiana State University. I picked Louisiana State University because I was very interested in a program there. Rudolf Haberle was an emigre from Germany. He was from the Schleswig-Holstein region of Germany in the far north, and he had written a book, From Democracy to Nazism, in which he analyzed elections because Schleswig-Holstein, though a very rural area, was overwhelmingly voting in favor of the National Socialist Party long before the rest of the country. The reason this is relevant for my presentation here is that if you read From Democracy to Nazism and you ask the question, what is the discipline of the person that wrote this book? You would be hard-pressed. You'd say, because of the way in which it's written and the types of data that are presented, you might say, I think maybe it was written by a historian, or maybe a political scientist, or maybe a demographer, sociologist. I'm not sure. Who was it? That was Haberle's approach. Haberle was very eclectic in his approach to political issues in terms of theories and methods that are used to study them. And so in my training, there's a big emphasis on looking at things in a historical perspective and looking at things in a comparative perspective and using multiple sources of data. I mean, that's just the way I was trained. And that's not a common orientation within American sociology anyway. So, but I consider myself fortunate to have then studied there. From there, I went to the University of Oklahoma, where I was there for 30 years as a professor. The main thing that happened there is this is a Research One university. So we work there. Research One university's professors work on what's called the 40-40-20 plan. You spend 40% of your time teaching, 40% of your time on research, 20% doing service. So with 40% of my time devoted to research, I was able to, you can study anything you want as long as you publish. And for the first few years, I did standard political stuff. But starting in the 1980s, a very close friend of mine committed suicide. And as I tried to deal with his suicide, I had to start dealing with my own Vietnam experience. And from that, then I started to do research on veterans. That's one of my areas, sociology of veterans issues. And then also the sociology of violence and war. So for the first 10 years of my career, I did standard political stuff, but since around 1985, I've been working primarily as a military sociologist. Well, after 30 years at the University of Oklahoma, I was invited to go to the Air Force Academy, and yes, that's what it looks like in winter. So I spent 15 years there, and of course, they brought me there because they wanted me to study military stuff. So 30 years at Oklahoma, 15 years at the Air Force Academy, 45 years. I figured I said everything I had to say. Obviously wasn't true because here I am talking again, but I retired last spring. If you're trying to figure out how old is this guy, 45 years as a professor, you're off because I got my PhD when I was 9, so okay. All right, so let's talk about veterans a little bit. So in this map here, map of the United States again, this shows where veterans live in the U.S. by state. And the important thing about this one is that you see that veterans live primarily in three very, very large states, Florida, Texas, and California. Um, Florida, Texas, and California, though, are enormous states. Um, I mean, in the case of Texas, you're talking about, a state within the U.S. that's the size of Germany. So um, that it's not surprising to see that most of our veterans live in those three states. So it's more helpful sometimes to look at one like this. And what you have here is veterans as a percent of the population over the age of 18 by state. And when you do it that way, you see that actually the veterans constitute less than 6% of the adult population of California. And when you look at it now, what you see is that Alaska, Montana, Wyoming, and West Virginia, those four states are ones in which veterans are more than 10% of the adult population of the state. Now, those isn't exactly where veterans come from. It's where they, remember, you could talk about states that veterans come from, but then there's also where do veterans live after they get out of the military, right? And so this represents where veterans are at after they've gotten out. And the thing I'll point out to you is Wyoming, Montana, and Alaska are very sparsely populated, rugged states where the basic philosophy is one of libertarianism. Live and let live, do your own, okay? And so a number of veterans are attracted to those states as places to live and live a particular lifestyle. If you look at where veterans come from, they come primarily from the South. The South is overrepresented among military members in the U.S. That is, if you took the percentage of the adult population that lives in the South, that's the only region of the country from which military membership is overrepresented. Okay, the others are underrepresented. Okay, so when we talk about veterans, just like here in the Netherlands, it's important to talk about veterans of which war. And so the way it works in the U.S., I think here in the Netherlands, as I understand it, if you did not serve in time of war, then you're a former soldier, right? So to be a veteran, you have to have served during time of war. In the U.S., the veteran is a more generic category encompassing both. But in order to be eligible for benefits of various kinds, you have to have served during time of war. So the big ones for us are, with veterans still living, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War I, and of course, Iraq and Afghanistan. So you can see here the level of participation. And World War II was an enormous mobilization for us. Almost 16 million soldiers served in World War II in the U.S. Massive mobilization, especially when you consider that when World War II broke out, the size of our military was 340,000. Went from 340,000 to 16 million. You may not be aware, but historically, the U.S. has had a very strong anti-military bias. The assumption from the start in the U.S. was that if the military is big enough to defend you, it's also big enough to control you and do you in. And so the preference from the start was to have a very, very small military, which would be augmented during time of war by a conscription, by a draft. So we'd always have a tiny military. A war would happen, the size of the military would be this big. The minute the war's over, military is this big again. So actually, if you look at the ratings of military prowess, military capacity, at the beginning of World War II, the United States was ranked number 34th in the world. So it had to go from that to somewhere in the top 5 in order to participate meaningfully in World War II. So massive mobilization there. You'll see that the veteran that qualifies as the forgotten veteran is the Korean War veteran, because it came on the heels of World War II. World War II had already been anointed as the greatest generation, and now you've got Korean War, which we didn't lose, but it ended in a stalemate. So the greatest generation label implied these great guys went off and took care of Germany and Japan, but these other guys couldn't even handle North Korea. All right, so the forgotten veteran. So even worse in the case of Vietnam, and then Gulf War. So you'll notice that we have declining participation here after 1973. Like other Western European nations, we go to an all-volunteer force. So the percentage of the population that has served in the armed forces currently in the United States is about 0.3%. 0.3%. Very, very low. All right, so I put together this table here. It's a little confusing, but I'll explain. First of all, believe it or not, if you ask the question, how many veterans are there in the United States, there's no straightforward way to get that answer, because we don't keep records of where everyone goes when they get out of the military. So you have to use a couple of different sources. Like we'll have a survey of the population, and in the course of the survey, they may ask, did you ever serve in the military? So that's the National Veterans Survey. Or sometimes on the census, it'll include a question, did you ever serve in the military? And there'll be calculations made from that, okay? So a couple of interesting things here. First of all, notice that the numbers of veterans are declining. The numbers of veterans peaked out at pretty close to 35 million. But that was back in the 1990s. And since then, the actual number of veterans in the United States has gone down. So that's a function of World War II veterans dying and the numbers of new veterans being created under an all-volunteer force rather than a draft. Those two things right there. So you can see since 2001, we had 25 million veterans in the U.S. Currently, the estimate is we have 19.2 million. And that's in time of war. We've been at war in Afghanistan and Iraq since 2002. So even though 18 years of continuous warfare, the numbers of veterans has gone down because we've done it with an all-volunteer force. At the time that I was in, there was conscription, and so I was born in 1946, so you can count, I'm 74 years old. 1946 is prime time cannon fodder, because following World War II, the soldiers came home, they got married real fast, 9 months later, and I'm on the first wave, okay? So I was born in 1946, and 1946 to 1954 is the only time in the last 150 years of the United States that the birth rate went up. Okay, so it's called the baby boom. Well, if you add 18, 19, 20 years to 1946, this big baby boom becomes eligible for the draft just as we start in Vietnam. And so you've got endless fodder for a war. And following the Vietnam War, though, we went to the all-volunteer force. Okay, so in my day, I did a tour in Vietnam for 12 months. That was a standard tour, 12 months. And then after one tour, most people who were conscripted, I was actually a volunteer, but that's another story. If you were drafted, you did one tour and you were done. If you look at veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, I mean, they've been there 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. All right, so in other words, we've got a very, very small, actually, we've only got a military, again, of under 500,000, fighting a war for 18 years. You got the same people rotating to Afghanistan, Iraq and Afghanistan, Afghanistan, back to Iraq, okay? So it's a very, very different dynamic there, one you're familiar with your force as well. So the other thing you can see here is that the percentage of the total veterans, about 45% of veterans used to be World War II and Korean War vets. You can see World War II vets in the U.S. are dying at the rate of almost 500 a day. Okay, they're in their 90s, and they're dropping left and right. So Vietnam veterans are still a third, but the average Vietnam veteran is starting to be like me in their 70s. So death rate mortality rates will kick in there, and you see 1/5 of our veterans now are veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. All right, so U.S. war casualties. Here's the U.S. Civil War, 1860 to 1865. I put that one in because this figure here, 365,000 soldiers dying in the course of the war, that's the Union Army. Okay? You lose, you don't get to be part of the big discussion, right? So those are troops from the North. There was another 258,000 who died in the war. Those are from the Confederate states, the southern states. If you put these two figures together, you've got a little over 700,000 soldiers dying in the war. More American soldiers died in the American Civil War than all our other wars combined. It's really something to think about. It's pretty. That is given that war took place in 1860, and we're talking 160 years later. That's still the one in which we have more deaths than all our other wars combined.
That's not surprisingly, because the machine gun came in 1866, and in that period of time they started to dig in, and the Confederate Army was the first army who introduced the, let's say, the trench war, and so that's mainly the reason before that time they're standing up in the field.
Yeah.
And obviously you are a little bit more easy to damage when you're standing up.
Yeah, exactly. And when General Ulysses S. Grant took over, remember the two generals, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, are both graduates of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, okay, because the U.S. military fractured into two parts. When Grant took over, he had 2 million troops. He looked at the Confederates. They had 1 million, and he went on a war of attrition. And they started fighting these famous battles one weekend after the other. It'd be 50,000 KIA a weekend until the Confederates were done. Okay, so the other thing that I've emphasized for you here is this is the ratio of the number of wounded to the number of deaths. So in the Civil War, you can see fewer soldiers were wounded than died. I know it doesn't make sense, but just take the words. Okay. If you got shot in a Civil War, the good news was you survived. The bad news was you survived because you're about to die in a medical service chain. All right. And part of the reason was that in those days they believed that if you had an infection from being shot, that the solution was to drain blood from you, that you had tainted blood that needed to be drained out. So you got shot, you lost a lot of blood, then you get the medical service thing, then it drained another couple pints out, okay? It's 180 degrees away from when it should be happening, is what it comes down to. But if you'll look here, that what's happened is that the ratio of wounded to deaths has gone up, and that's primarily a result of changes in the medical service chain, all right? So like in the case of Vietnam veterans, it's not unusual to find Vietnam veterans who are not only amputees, but they're double amputees and triple amputees who survived, right? In my own case, I know that if someone suffered a traumatic amputation in the field, if you could get a helicopter in within about 20 minutes or so, even for a double amputation or a triple amputation, you got about 20 minutes. If you can get the helicopter in and get the person out, there's a chance, right? And so the ratio of wounded to soldiers who died goes up. So in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, you see that the number of deaths here is just under 7,000 after 18 years. And that the ratio of those who show up as wounded is almost 8 to 1, right? So when we talk about the veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, you're talking about a lot of severely wounded vets who survived. And that needs to be part of the equation as you think about who that category is, all right? You see here the size of the mobilization, and this is the total deaths wounded for numbers in theater. All right, so let's talk about some recent issues. This is Regis University in Denver, Colorado. Yes, it looks like that. Nice. Regis University, about 10 years ago, there was a professor of history, and he put in a course called The Experience of War. And it started out as a small seminar, maybe 10 or 15 students. And he invited, his specialty was World War II. He invited World War II vets to drop in and sit in on the class and make comments now and then. And 2 or 3 did. By the time I saw the class 5 years later, he expanded it from just not have World War II vets, but he had World War II vets for a while, and then he'd have Korean War vets come in, then he'd have Vietnam vets come in, then he'd have veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan come in. The night I went to talk about my experiences, it was an auditorium. The auditorium held 500 people or so, and the overflow was in another room with a video feed. And I've never seen anything like it for a college class. What happened is that there was a local radio station that specializes in period music, you know, like music of the 20s or World War II music, music of the 60s and so forth. And a DJ on there, say the show was music of World War II, the 40s, you know. He would say, tonight at Regis University, Experience of War class, they're going to have some World War II veterans there. If you want to drop in, you know, you got a radio station telling what the syllabus for the class is. And so the number of veterans who would show up to tell their stories, and the number of drop-ins who would come to listen to the stories of the veterans grew to where the number of drop-ins was, you know, 500-600 people. Thursday nights is when the clap met. I've never seen anything like that, but it was pretty cool. And so this started to bring up this issue of memory. And because, first of all, they discovered in the course of this that there was a guy showing up who gave some of the most wonderful testimony from World War II, who in fact was not a veteran. And I'm not a cognitive psychologist, but I'm in a department of behavioral sciences at the University of at the Air Force Academy, and I was talking to my colleagues who are cognitive psychologists, and I asked, like, I'm going to go talk about my memories of Vietnam. Like, how much can you trust memory? You know, how's memory work? And so. For a couple of things they pointed out to me. First of all, your memory, things that are recorded in memory is not the same as if you took a video camera and scanned it over a thing, right? A video camera is going to record everything in sight, but that's not how your memory works. That is, for lots of reasons, way your brain works is that it focuses on certain types of information that you've learned are relevant to, making it through the day. It tends to focus on those and overlook other stuff that it doesn't just routinely consider relevant in fast thinking. Okay, so first of all, what's taken and stored at the neural level in the brain involves a certain amount of selective perception. It's not everything that took place. It's the stuff that was relevant, your brain decided was relevant to store. Now, in the case of a traumatic event, the storage process is a little different than if it's a routine thing. So you probably can't remember what you had for breakfast a week ago, Wednesday. It's a routine kind of thing, unless you eat the same thing every morning, maybe. But in the case of trauma, the encoding is much, much more intense, and it's more diverse. So, for instance, when I started having flashbacks in Vietnam during the 1980s, when I started trying to process, one of the things I noticed is olfactory. I would smell burning things, and it was almost overwhelming. So what I'm going to point out is that in that event, in addition to what you visually saw, your other senses are operating, your nose, your olfactories, your auditory, and so forth. And those things in a really traumatic event tend to be encapsulated as well. The thing about veterans' memory is that it tends to get a privileged status. It takes a lot of guts when a veteran is telling his story or her story to raise your hand and say, I'm not sure you got that right. Okay, I mean, you may be misremembering, but right? That is, particularly if, the person's got the decorations and so forth, there's a tendency to, okay, here's what the person remembers, must have been the way it is. However, misremembering is problematic, and here's where the errors come in. When you remember something, okay, what's happening is your brain's going to retrieve what's encoded there at the neural level and bring it into conscious memory. When that retrieval process takes place, there's gaps in what was stored. And there's a tendency to fill in the gaps in order to make what you're remembering coherent. So your filling in the gaps might be consistent with the original scene, or it may diverge from the original scene. All right? Furthermore, like when you retrieve something out of memory and then fill in the gaps and put it back, now what's in memory is what was originally there, plus you're filling the gaps. Okay? As a matter of fact, every time you bring something out of memory, the problem is that new information gets added in. So, like for me, I struggle to keep, I really struggle. I try to keep my memories of what took place pure. But I can't really do that because I've read all kinds of stuff about Vietnam since 1985. I've watched the Ken Burns series on the Vietnam War since 1985. And that's new information that can color the memories that I'm calling forth. And once that new information marries up with what was just retrieved, that goes back into memory too. And so the bottom line is, it requires a lot of effort to validate your memories. So for instance, in my case, what I did was, I thought, okay, well, I wonder if there's anything about 4th Infantry Division. What do you do these days? You Google it, right? So Google 4th Infantry Division. Well, the amount of information that's available on units in Vietnam is totally dependent upon one guy who's got a lot of time on his hands and knows something about computers, who decides to establish a website. And it so happens I was in the 1st Battalion, 14th Infantry. Someone from the 1st to 14th established a website and spent a lot of time putting in timelines and pictures and all kinds of information. So if I type in 1st to the 14th.org, this website comes up. And it says 1st to the 14th in Vietnam. The 1st to the 14th got there in 1966. It was there until December of 1970. He's got every year set up. And he's put a chronology in there with, like, for instance, KIA, those killed in action by month. So I can go to, I was actually there in 1968 to 69. I can go to November 1968, and I can look, and I can go month by month to November 1969, and sure enough, like on my birthday, bad things happened. I can look up my birthday, and there they are, listed, the KIA in my platoon, right? So I can validate certain things. You know, usually when I look at it, I think, ooh, I don't, he must have died after we put him on the helicopter. I didn't know he died, okay? But when I look at the KIA record, I can match my memory. And what I find is that my memory tends to be fairly pure or clear for about 4 or 5 months. And after that, it gets murky. And I can't remember exactly when or where. It gets to be a collage of stuff that I've been able to reorganize by looking at the 1st to the 14th website. Okay. He also has morning reports and other stuff in there, so I can look up stuff. But the point is that it requires, you have to be careful. I found, and I'm not just talking about my experience. My experience is you have to be careful getting up and talking about what it is you did and da-da-da and so forth. Because it's possible, it's very easy to misremember things. Okay? So we can talk a little bit more about that if you like, but a friend, you know George Mastriani, a colleague of mine just wrote a book on misremembering Buchenwald, the concentration camp, the liberation of the, so in other words, there's testimony there at the Holocaust Museum from World War II veterans that can't possibly be correct. As an example, one veteran talks a great deal about his time at Buchenwald, liberating Buchenwald in order to remember, and he has a tremendous amount of detail in terms of approaching the camp and so forth, but he says that there was a arch sign over the main entrance that said Arbeit macht frei, right? That gate doesn't exist at Buchenwald. That was at Auschwitz in Poland, right? There was a sign inside the camp at Buchenwald, but you had to be looking out, and it said in German the equivalent of zum jeden. Yeah, it means to each. Well, the translation of it would be, the best translation would be you each get what they deserve, right? So if the memory is Arbeit macht frei, that has to be something that was added in later, right, from another source. Okay, so anyway, personal memory.
I think you're
Yeah.
saying that there is a distinction between generic information and your own memories, and there's a mix-up during time when generic information is used as your own and put in place actually or next to what your own memories are.
That's correct. Yes. And, you know, and well, I'll come to the point in just a minute. But that's what occurs, right? Is that like if I watch the Ken Burns series on the Vietnam War, now all of a sudden I've got a visual documentary, right? And when I pull my own memories out, some of that gets married to that, and then it goes back into memory, right? So I don't have a pure. Even the first pure memory is not necessarily representative, right? There's big issues here, like in trials, right? The Me Too type trials, for instance, right? So there's big legal questions here as well.
I recognize what you're saying. We have the history of Srebrenica, and I have veterans of my own unit who tell that they have been with every occasion that happened over there, although they were on the other side of the spot. So they take the whole history with them, telling them or using them as their own, of even believing that they are part of their own history, although they were not there at that certain moment.
Yes.
So it's also in our everyday business, we are having those kind of experiences of our own veterans.
Right.
Exactly what you are sharing with us.
Right. Okay, so let's do collective memory. Now, collective memory is not just my memory. Okay, so what did happen in Vietnam? All right, that's a matter of collective memory. So by its very nature, the collective part's negotiated. And the way to think about this, and this is what I was trying to tell the reporter yesterday, I think he thought he was getting a historian because he wanted to know about the history of liberation of the Netherlands. And I had to say, ooh, wait a minute. By the way, if you want slides, I'll leave them with Gilt and you can have copies. Okay. The way to think about this is that these memories and other claims are involved in a contest with each other for primacy. All right? So there's competing ideas about what happened. This is true anytime. And so there's lots of actors out there, state leaders, state agencies, veterans organizations, and so forth, making claims of various sort. And what you have to do is work very hard to make your contested claim get taken for granted as a fact. The reporter yesterday had a lot of trouble when I tried to explain that to him, so part of it was my explanation, part of it I'm giving him a whole new idea. But if you think of like cigarette smoking and lung cancer, right? I mean, for years, media advertising of cigarettes used doctors. You know, it'd be an ad that says more doctors smoke Camels than any other brand. All right, because there was a positive relationship between social class and smoking. As you went up in class, smoking was more common with pipes and rolled cigarettes and so forth. People down at the bottom of the class system couldn't afford rolled cigarettes, and they were, clumsily rolling their own and that kind of stuff. They couldn't afford good pipe tobacco and cigars. The cigarette companies argue to the whole thing that you can't prove that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. You can't put together a definitive classical experimental design. But doctors in the AMA who specialize in diseases of the lung began to collect data. And what they found is that, first of all, through the correlational studies, if you smoke a lot, you're probably going to come down with emphysema and lung cancer. Lung cancer is a rare disease among people who don't smoke. So a correlational study provides. The other thing you find is the replication. You find the same kinds of pattern over and over again. So replication is important. So you see counterclaims coming out. So you have a contested fact, and in lots of different places, that you have champions out there, some arguing cigarette smoking causing lung cancer, other spokespersons out there representing the cigarette company saying, no, it doesn't, and so forth. These days, we take it as it's a taken for granted fact that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. Cigarette packs even say it. Pick it up. Look, in the U.S., I don't know if you do that here, but pick up a cigarette pack. It says, smoking this will give you lung cancer, right? So, in other words, a contested fact got shuffled down the road. There were champions out there that managed to get their version of it as a taken for granted fact. Something similar to that happens with the politics of commemoration. And if you want, there's a book by Theodore Ashplant on the politics of commemoration. If you read the first 90 pages of the book, you could summarize it in a chart like this. Okay, so down here are the personal, these are the personal memory, this is personal memory down here, personal narratives. And there's pre-existing cultural templates that people use, that veterans use, in order to make sense out of their memories of the war, how the war came about, the meaning of the war, and so forth. Um, uh, and from this, there are views then of what the war was all about. Coming from the top are the state-preferred narratives, okay? So, you know, it wasn't my idea to go to Vietnam. You know, the President of the United States and his staff up there came up with explanations for why it was. Those are the state-preferred explanations for why all this thing started, okay? And what the war was all about, and those come down from above. And here's your agencies. You've got the state power, political institution, the armed forces, veterans organizations are out there doing it. Here's where the arenas where they take place. What do you say at a public memorial? How about museums? If you go to a museum, what account does the museum give of the war? Artistic expressions, private rituals, and so forth. So what you get are all these clashing narratives as to what happened in, let me do my case. What happened in the case of Vietnam? Why did we think it was necessary to go? Why did we do what we do? What we did? Why did we continue to do what we did even when we got the idea it wasn't a good idea, and so forth, right? So not everyone agrees upon that. It's a contest. But some champions advancing certain narratives do so more effectively than others, either because they have access to media when someone else doesn't, or because they have more money to spend on it, or they're better at, for lots of reasons. Right? This is a contest for public opinion. And so it's helpful to think about it in this way. Yesterday, you know, I told the reporter, look, there's probably very few people in the Netherlands who think that Germany should have won the war. Okay, so there's not people out there saying the Netherlands shouldn't have been liberated. But still, there's lots of questions about why the war in the Netherlands took the form that it did. And what about the issue of resistance versus those who collaborated and so forth? You know, when I was in France interviewing veterans of the war in Algeria, the big issue there, where I was in Clermont-Ferrand, not far away from there, is the headquarters for the Vichy government during the war. So this whole issue of who resisted and who collaborated is a really dynamic issue in France yet. So clashing narratives going on here with an effort on the part of taking your preferred narrative, the one that you've got, and moving it to the point where it's taken as the story, is the way you want to think about this. All right, so am I doing okay? Okay, let's get going. All right, so what I did here is I divided up our wars into good wars and bad wars, okay? And so one of the things, I think veteran status depends somewhat on the type of war you're coming out of, all right? So in the case of the Vietnam War, highly stigmatized. You know, my experience, I am one of the veterans coming home did have stuff thrown at them. I don't think it was as common as it's often portrayed, but I can tell you it happened to me when I came home. So when my bus went from Fort Lewis, Washington to the Seattle airport, it was pelted with eggs and tomatoes. One of the things about Vietnam veterans, people who were for the war tended to be somewhat contemptuous of veterans. A lot of them were World War II veterans, you know, the the greatest generation. And they were wondering, we handled the Germans and the Japs, you can't handle the Vietnamese? You know, that kind of thing. So my first fight when I got home was with a World War II vet who was making statements at me in the bar, something like that. And so I lost it. But the Korean War vets, ignored, okay. Here's your greatest generation. Now over here, we've got the all-volunteer force. And I didn't move veterans of Iraq and, well, Persian Gulf War only lasted 100 hours. So everyone says, what kind of war is that? Only 100 hours. I mean, come on. Iraq and Afghanistan I put right here as privileged but superficial. And that is, people fawn over the Afghanistan and Iraq vets a lot in the United States, but they don't have any idea how to talk to them. They just seem awfully glad that they didn't have to go. You went, I didn't have to go. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, it's kind of where it's at there. And so you will see also that about 2/3 these days, about 2/3 of veterans and about 2/3 of adults in the United States think the war in Iraq was not worth fighting. So, all of a sudden, Iraq vets and Vietnam vets, we have a lot to talk about. So what do you do with all those deaths when you fight in a war that people are now saying it's not worth fighting? Outside of, I wish you'd figured that out back in 2002. I used to say, wish you'd figured that out back in 1965. So this is an issue then for veterans. What do you do with these things? Whoop. Uh-oh. Whoop, I hit the wrong button altogether. Okay, there we go. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip some. Okay, so let me do a couple of things on Vietnam vets and Afghanistan. In the case of World War II vets, my perception is that World War II vets as a group tend to cut each other a lot of slack, even when they disagree politically. Lots of World War II vets served in Congress and other political positions, and some were Democrats, some were Republicans, and I think they used the fact their common veteranness led them to listen to each other, even though they disagreed. That didn't really happen with Vietnam vets. When we came home, the country was divided, and furthermore, we were divided. Now, so if I meet another vet, he's going to agree, and they're mostly guys because we had gender segregated force. If I meet another Vietnam vet, we're going to agree that we were betrayed in some way. The question is, who betrayed us? That's where the disagreement comes in. I've been to a lot of American Legion and Veterans of Foreign War posts, and when you walk in, there's this sniffing around, talking with each other for about 5 or 10 minutes, trying to figure out what kind of Vietnam veteran are you? Are you... And the fastest way to do it is just say Jane Fonda. If you say anti-war activist, you say Jane Fonda and you see the jugular vein starting to beat in the side of the neck, okay, the person thinks the anti-war movement did us in. If you're on the other side, you're more likely to think General Westmoreland. I mean, come on, he's the guy that designed the strategy. So, in the case of the veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq, a lot of them are beginning to feel the sense of betrayal as well because of this sense that the war was not worth fighting. But exactly how the blame is placed is a little more diffuse. There's disagreement over the rules of engagement, maybe lack of will by top political leaders. It's not as clear cut, but there is the sense of betrayal that I'm starting to detect there. The other thing that happened when World War II vets came home in mass, they joined a couple of big veterans organizations. The biggest one was the American Legion. American Legion had 6-7 million members, huge. When we came home, World War II vets didn't embrace us. Basically, we were rejected by World War II vets for lots of reasons. And so Vietnam veterans did not join the American Legion or the VFW. which these days is the death of the Legion, because only 3% of the population is a World War II vet now, and Vietnam vets are 30%. And so the American Legion is going under as a result of this here. The veterans of Iraq and of Afghanistan and Iraq, the Legion is trying desperately to embrace the veterans of the new war because they're dying. I mean, the Legion is dying demographically, and they need new vets. But Afghanistan and Iraq vets are not interested in joining big veterans organization. They're more interested in forming their own self-help organizations. And frequently they ask other non-veterans to join them. So, for instance, you very, very commonly will see a local organization of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who also have first responders, firemen and policemen, police officers being invited and made to be standard members of the organization. That's a trend we didn't see before. All right, so I'm speeding it up, and we're getting to the end. This is a professor of American Studies and Literature at the University of Southern California, Dr. Viet Nguyen. And so this relates to what we were talking about before. What he argues is that there's some ethics in remembering and commemorating. And he makes one of the arguments that I presented to you already, and that is what you should do is put some effort into validating your own memories. Don't just rely solely upon memory, but look at other sources to try to help validate what it is that you're remembering to you can get at the underlying truth, the veracity of them. But he also says there's the ethics of remembering others. What about those whose voices who don't get heard? In that contest of competing claims, there's some voices that are lost. So what about those voices? Don't they get a voice in the narrative? So always pay attention to the voices of others. PTSD. I talk with Vietnam veterans and others a lot, and they talk PTSD. What do you think the PTSD rate is in Baghdad? And we can talk about the PTSD rate among veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. What do you think it is in Baghdad? What effect do you think it has? Afghanistan. Afghanistan's been at war since 1980. They were invaded by the Soviets in 1980. So there you're looking at 40 years. Now what's the rate of PTSD in Helmand province, as an example of asking a question, right? So this is what he means by the ethics of remembering others. For Vietnam veterans, it's NAM. NAM starts in 1965 and it ends in 1972. But that's not the war in Vietnam, okay? So that's what I mean by the ethics of remembering others. And when he says when you try to do this ethically, you create just memory. Just memory. And what happens with just memory is that it extends, when you do it this way, it extends the awareness of consequences beyond those solely affected by the war. It's not just about us. And I'm talking about now about Vietnam veterans. It's not just about us. There's a wider range of groups here. And he says if you do this, it tends to reduce the enthusiasm for subsequent war. One of the dangers that you see around veterans a lot is, I just look at the T-shirts that are sold for veterans in the United States. It's all chest pounding, I was there, I'm tough, and all that kind of stuff, which tends to glorify what happened. And so his argument is that if you sensitize yourself to the full range of those affected by the war, it tends to reduce some of this enthusiasm for just making war as a matter of policy. Okay. All right. I have that picture. This is a memorial Soldier Stone in Colorado. It's located, it's about 15 miles off the road, right? 15 miles up the road. You've got a four-wheel drive vehicle. You've got to have a really good four-wheel drive vehicle to get even close to it. And when you get close to it, you ain't there yet. And it's located at 4,000 meters above sea level, where the tree line gives out in Colorado. And I'm going to show you a little clip. Takes a minute or two. There's a young woman and her boyfriend on dirt bikes riding up a trail and then to an open field, and this is what they encounter. Oop. Hang on. I'm not sure this is the best way to resolve this, but okay. Okay.
Okay, so we're dirt biking along the old Continental Divide. And we come across this memorial out in the middle of nowhere. And it's not marked on any maps. Memory of long wars lost in the soldiers of Vietnam. Laos. But then there are there's live rounds here. And then you can see these are just random. There's one here. There's one China. like they're in a circle around the actual. Someone's like hiding in here. I read that the park rangers keep this location private, and it took us a long time to get up here. Did I get this guy? I think it's called Sargent's Memorial.
Okay, Soldier Stone. It was built by a lieutenant colonel. He was a special forces um, um, special operative. Um, not just during the period of the Vietnam War, but which we consider from the American point of view, 1965 to 1973. He was actually there in the late 50s and early 1960s. And he built, this is Sergeant's Pass. It's at 4,000 meters above sea level. You see the tree line is given out and there's meadow. And of course, the picture I had at the beginning was covered in snow. That was in October. So right now there's probably 50 or 60 inches of snow over it. But he built it by himself. So the question is, and it's not a Vietnam veteran memorial, you notice. It's a Vietnam War memorial. And you see part of it is in Laotian or in Cambodian and Vietnamese and so forth. So it's a Vietnam War memorial. And then there's this question, why would he put it where it's almost impossible to get to it? You know, like how many people? But veterans find their way there, as you can tell from the things that were left behind. Okay, I've taken up a lot of your time there. Let me stop and let's take any questions or discussion you want to do.
Questions?
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I was wondering about the sense of betrayal you mentioned.
Uh-huh.
Do you know how Second World War veterans in the United States feel about this? Did they feel a sense of some betrayal by the government or something like that?
Okay, it's a question, how do the World War II veterans feel about Vietnam veterans or about their war?
About their war?
Oh, no, you know, one of the things about World War II is that well, first of all, the U.S. experience of World War II and the European experience of World War II are two different things, right? I mean, if you saw the chart there, we lost 420,000 troops. We lost almost no civilians, right? Almost none. And yet, if you take the 60 million victims of World War II, almost 70% of them are civilians. And those civilians lived here, and they lived in Japan. Lived here in Europe, and they lived in Japan, right? So, Soviet Union, Russia, that was 25 million folks in World War II. So the European idea of World War II is very different. With us, just like, we tend to be ethnocentric. So World War II starts with us landing at Normandy, and we sweep through, and then we go bomb Japan, so forth. So that our experience with it tends to be dramatic, heroic. It was a just war. We brought everything to bear. We triumphed. And by God, that's what we need, is another war like that again, right? It's the epitome of the good war. Actually, it's atypical. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was wondering, all the wars that followed on territories of other countries,
Uh-huh.
were they like attempts to have a good war again, and then it kind of fell out of place afterwards, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you would say that we attempted to have a good war. The desire was that there is a way to do a good war, okay, like World War II, and that's what we want to do. Actually, that's what modern militaries are equipped, configured, and trained to do, right? Is to fight another near peer in a conventional manner. Whereas, even in the case of the United States, most wars, if you take conventional wars, we've only got a few. The Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea. That's it. Everything else has been one of those small, dirty wars. And
Is that part of a generic desire to be relevant?
yes, and I mean, what's happened over and over again is we are configured, trained, and so forth to fight the good big war, but we get involved in a small, dirty one, so we've got to make them. In the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, sometimes we need to get this over with so that we can get back to China and Russia. That's really what we're configured to do. And so there's an effort to like in the case of Vietnam, in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, initially, you have the attempt to impose a conventional good war script on the battle space, even if it doesn't fit. We try to make it a war like that. The problem is that the use of violence, the way in which violence is used, lethal violence is employed in a conventional war and in a small, dirty war, is very different, and it doesn't necessarily work in the same calculus. So, like in the case of Vietnam, we use the body count as our metric. The body count is almost a meaningless metric in a small, dirty war. The Soviets take Afghanistan. Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1980 and left in 1989. They had a 70-to-1 kill ratio. Really, how do you lose a war with a 70-to-1 kill ratio? It takes some doing, right? But with the 70-to-1 kill ratio, there were more mujahideen lined up to take them on in 1989 than there was in 1980, right? That's okay. So what kind of metric might work in a small, dirty war? Like, how about the number of days a week in your area of operation that the markets are open? An open market, a market, where farmers and others bring their stuff in the market and people actually go there and buy produce and stuff. An open market tells you they're not afraid to go to market that day. And so the security there is sufficient to allow everyday life to go on. And so the number of days per week that the markets are open may be a better metric of how much progress there is in that area than the kill ratio, which may be actually an indication of how well you're not doing. You follow? I mean, you need different metrics. You need different mindset. You need different configurations than we ordinarily use in conventional war. And also, it goes to the root of your question. Thank you. If you go back to this, the ethics of commemoration, that whole good war idea, as we think about it in the United States, also leaves out all those civilian victim groups, like, I understand, I've seen the argument over and over again as to why we would say firebomb Tokyo. And we killed more people in Tokyo than Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? 100,000 folks in one night. I mean, that's a step. There's a reason for doing those kinds of things. But, I mean, can you really I just said 100,000 folks died in one night. Those were almost all civilians. How can that 100,000 just roll off your tongue? There's a lot of lives there, right? So not being sensitive to those other victim groups changes the way in which you think about the goodness of a war. I mean, really, that was a big, dirty war, right? In which anything goes. Most of the participants reached the point where they thought it was okay to bomb civilian neighborhoods as a matter of course, because both sides discovered that bombing civilian neighborhoods had a tremendous emotional impact on the willingness of population to fight and fight back. So I understand that's part of the tough reality of war. But what the ethics of commemoration here, as Professor Nguyen is talking about it, is asking you to do is to think about what that means and use that as part of motivation for finding ways where you don't live in a world where you have to do stuff like that to start out with. I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Thank you for your presentation. I was interested in what you say about the just memories. Can we connect this also to the just war theory?
Yes. No, what happens the reason it's connected to the just war idea is that those competing narrative, what motivated, you notice he's got a Vietnamese name, okay? He was born in Vietnam. When he was 4 years old, his parents fled Vietnam to Los Angeles, and so he was raised in this country. His book, he won a Pulitzer Prize for a book called The Sympathizer. If you're interested, really, really very clever, very, very clever book that'll get you thinking about things on lots of different levels. As a Vietnamese American, what concerned him is how the Vietnamese Americans have almost no voice in this narrative about what was the Vietnam War all about, how did it go down, how did it end, what does it mean. They have almost no voice in that. They're just another Asian minority out there in Los Angeles. Okay, and none of them have been able to make a movie which represents their point of view and get that into the discussion. They've been consultants on movies like Rambo, and things like that, but Rambo is not really about anyone but Rambo, okay? So to answer your question, part of the just war thing here is that not only should I be obsessing about my own memory, my own war experiences, but I should be the area that I was in, there wasn't just South Vietnamese and North Vietnamese and me. There were also Montagnard Hill tribes, okay, which are ethnically distinct from Vietnamese. Um, so, I should be concerned about the Montagnards and where these hill people fit. I mean, they were very, very different than Vietnamese. They did slash and burn agriculture. They lived in the area I was in. It was mountainous triple canopy jungle. It's not conducive to rice paddies. And if I came upon a village out there, it was going to be a Montagnard village in which they did slash and burn agriculture in the middle of the jungle. What about those people? Who's telling their story? That's what he's saying. Identify those other folks and make an effort to make their story part of the narrative. Okay, that's what he means by just memory. Yes.
And isn't their story coming across because of disinterest on American part, or perhaps even disinterest to share their story to the rest of the world from the people affected by the war?
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't their story coming out?
Well, they don't have a Hollywood to help get it out there to start out with, right?
Hollywood isn't interested.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about the contest is, there's lots of arenas out there. And, movies about the war, memorials, museums, public commemorations, all those things are moments where the story gets told. Let me give you an example. I hope it makes you laugh at its absurdity, but I was at the University of Oklahoma for 30 years, okay? Oklahoma originally was called Indian Territory. It was a region in the middle of the country where when Indian tribes were defeated, they would take the remnants of them and move them to Oklahoma, where they were supposed to have their own area in which to live in perpetuity. Now, that didn't happen. What happened after a while is whites in surrounding states said, the Indians don't need all that room here. So there was a land rush then where white settlers rushed in their wagons and their stuff and conquered the area and took over and so forth. That's why it's called the Sooner State, because the land rush was supposed to take place at 10 o'clock in the morning on a specific day, and the settlers lined up in their wagons and horses around the perimeter of the area, and then someone was supposed to fire a gun, and then everyone was supposed to rush in and you could stake. Well, some people snuck in the night before and hid in bushes, and then when the gun went off, they just stepped out and took the choice. They went sooner than they were supposed to, right? So Oklahoma's the Sooner State. So we were commemorating the land run of 100 years later in 1987, right? And someone suggested that that they were going to have this covered wagon come across a place in the river near where the university was. The river is not very deep and mostly sandbars. And so someone suggested then, well, if the settlers are coming across the river in a covered wagon with horses, but we got to have Indians in here somewhere. After all, it was Indian territory. And someone suggested, why don't we have the Indians attack the wagon as it comes across? Wait a minute. What happened in the land run was this was Indian territory. And Indians were about to lose their territory to settlers who would come in. You follow? So to commemorate the event by having Indians attack the wagons implies that there was something just going on that the Indians were trying to prevent, that type thing. Yeah. And so the Indians pretty much, no, we're not doing it, and so forth. But it shows you that there's the politics of commemoration, right? So what do you show in a public event in which you are remembering collectively something that took place, okay? And it's a contest, again, of ideas of what's appropriate and whose voices are being heard and what's the taken for granted story that needs to be told here, and so forth. That's what I have in mind.
I think it's about time. Is there a final question? Because we can also do it informally with the twee mensen die wel in de zin zijn. Ja, alsjeblieft, final applause. Louis de Vos.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming here on this, let's say, typical day.